Ready for your weekly tech fix? Want to know how technology sets us free? Well, get ready because here it comes. Tired of boring specials about history, science, and technology? Then get on your best headphones because you might want to lay down for this. A Sovryn Tech special with the world's foremost anarchist technophile, Brian Sovryn. He has a huge, well, you know. And now, here's Brian.
That's right, it is I, Brian Sovryn, the Golden Stallion of the tech world, here for another great episode of Sovryn Tech. I'm also a guy that, interestingly, little tidbits about me, I still wear a calculator watch. How about that? One of the two models still developed, one of them by Casio. But anyway, what that has to do with anything, I'm not sure. But here we go. We have, speaking, because that's kind of an older technology that's gone by the wayside. Really, watches in general have gone by the wayside, though they might be coming back. That's something we'll talk about in a future Sovryn Tech. But speaking of obsolete technologies and things that may be obsolete, I have with me, this is very exciting, returning to Sovryn Tech, I have Ricardo Obsolete with me, Rich Dana, actually.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, you are the proprietor, the head, the creator of Obsolete Magazine.
That's correct.
Yeah, and I love Obsolete Magazine. Absolutely love it. I get issues, and actually I get some of those issues. I get them sent around to some of the local comic book shops here, and a lot of people seem to really, really enjoy the magazine. But for anyone new, it's been a while. You've been on the show before. It's been a little while. So if you could give me an update on what Obsolete Magazine is and what is going on now for Obsolete Magazine, because you got some pretty exciting developments happening.
Yeah, we do. For people who've never heard of it, they can go to obsolete-press.com and they can check out back issues. We've got PDFs of quite a few of the back issues that are available for free online. And we've got some books. We've started branching out into publishing books. We've got 2 books out now as well. One's the best of Obsolete, the best of the first 6 issues, and another book of poetry by an Austin poet named Joe Hoppe. Obsolete Magazine sort of started as a response to the idea that the magazine was obsolete and the underground newspaper was obsolete. And for some of us who are old enough to remember those sort of smudgy newsprint tabloids that were put out by all sorts of radical groups back in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s and even into the 90s, there's sort of a special experience and a special connection to reading, sort of radical ideas put in that paper newsprint format. And
now, I mean, that's something that was like really these underground magazines were in a very real sense like a proto-internet.
Sure.
At least, yeah, I mean, in the freedom of information that was out there. Underground is definitely the word for it too. I mean, but you can read a lot of, I know I've read some authors like Harlan Ellison who would talk about the real power of these underground magazines, as well as a bunch of other people, from like say the 70s or even before, or even into the 80s and 90s, and these magazines were very, very popular. So you're making sure these things don't go away.
Well, we're trying. It's not easy. It's not even easy to find a newspaper printing company that will print them. We're lucky enough to be. I'm here in Iowa, and we still have a small local printer that prints, the penny savers and stuff like that. And he'll sneak ours in between big orders, and print us out 3,000-4,000 copies. And it's kind of a lost art form in a lot of ways, and it's just kind of hard to believe, because there was a time every city, there was the Chicago Seed, and New York had the East Village Other, and San Francisco had their own, and there were every sort of political party and the Socialist Workers Party had the Worker, and all these different groups would put out these magazines, and they were all sort of slapdash, and sometimes they were typed on typewriters, and with lots of collage artwork and stuff, and they were very much in the zine sort of aesthetic. We're lucky enough to have Mick Farron write for us, who, if people don't know, Mick Farron was in the Social Deviants, which I consider to be one of the first punk rock bands, and has written for Hawkwind and Motorhead and other bands, but he's also a great science fiction writer. He was also, a lot of people don't know, he was the editor of the International Times, which was a UK underground paper that's probably the biggest underground paper in the world at the time.
Wow. Now, I knew of his work with Motorhead, but I did not know about the rest of this.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and so Mick is an old friend of mine from my days in the East Village in New York, and he is just thrilled that we're doing this, and has committed to doing a piece for each issue. So we're really thrilled, and they're sort of stream of consciousness, sci-fi, political diatribes, a la William S. Burroughs or something. And they're really great, but it's, I'm really honored to have Mick among the people. I think he kind of lends us a little credibility in terms of our historical context.
Sure, absolutely. Now you've got a Kickstarter going on for this magazine. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, we started on a shoestring. We did a Kickstarter in 2010, and we did an Indiegogo campaign last year, and we were able to sort of get donations to keep going from issue to issue. And this time we decided to sort of go big or stay home. We're trying to raise $12,000 to put out the next 4 issues. And we're asking for people to pledge, and in return they'll get subscriptions mailed to their door. They won't have to look around for a stack of them in their local coffee shop or whatever. Plus we've got all sorts of other awesome perks, like silkscreen newspaper carrier bags and T-shirts, and all the usual great swag that people offer for their Kickstarter campaign. So it's a little bit quixotic, the hope to raise this much dough, but we've got a lot of people who love the magazine. We're hoping that they're going to get behind us and pledge and want to get subscriptions. So people can find details about that at our website again, which is obsolete-press.com, or you could just go to Kickstarter and search for Obsolete Magazine, and it'll come right up. So I'd encourage your listeners, if they go to the website and read some back issues for free online, and if they dig it, we'd love to have them pledge and be a part of Obsolete. We're also always looking for advertisers, retail outlets, and we're also always looking for new contributors. So if they're writers, cartoonists, poets, photographers, anybody who's making work, whether it be nonfiction or fiction, that challenges the status quo, we're all about it. We'd love to hear from your listeners.
Awesome. Yeah, and I can't recommend it enough to my listeners as well. In fact, I will admit that some of my listeners, if they hadn't noticed in recent episodes, there's been a couple of slots opening up for advertising, and you will be hearing a Obsolete magazine ad being played on through Sovryn Tech in the very near future. Actually, might even start with this episode or the next, so they can catch up on that. But it is just great. I want it. I want to promote it on my show because I believe in it, and because I think it's such exciting stuff and such great content. And with some of the content, there's a lot of, it's got everything that I'm interested in. It's got science fiction, it's got some great overall essays. It's even got some DIY stuff in it that are pretty interesting. Like any of those in particular that you found really good as far as the do-it-yourself stuff in it, Rich?
Yeah, well. For people who may not know me, outside of Obsolete magazine, I've spent a lot of years around the energy industry and the utility industry, and I've been involved in alternative energy technologies since the mid '90s. And so I've always been fascinated with the DIY solutions. A lot of the stuff that I grew up on in the '70s during the energy crisis, during the oil embargo, that was sort of the beginning of the back to the land era with Mother Earth news.
Right.
And there were always all these plans going around for how to heat your house with solar, homemade solar panels and all this kind of stuff.
I remember there's an issue of Mother Earth News, not that I was alive when this came out, but I remember looking into it. But there's an issue of Mother Earth News where they had an article where you could make an Opel, which was a car. You can make an Opel run on batteries, essentially, it was essentially an electric car, and it had the full plans and everything. Amazing. So yeah, definitely, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and there also, people may remember or have heard of the Whole Earth Catalog or the Whole Earth Review, and it was another one that we're sort of heavily influenced by that at Obsolete. It was all about providing people with the tools they needed to live independently and live free of the of the government or of oppressive forces, or free of fossil fuels, or it was all about supplying people with the tools they needed for freedom, however they defined that. And so we try and sort of dabble in that too. I had an article about our own here at my farm. We have a geodesic dome greenhouse that's made completely out of recycled electrical conduit. And we had an article about how to convert your gas vehicle to run on propane. And we've had an article about how to build your own methane digester to use your lawn clippings and your dog poop to make burnable gas, So we've had all sorts of crazy stuff, and it's something that I've written about as a consultant. I've worked on seriously. I've done it sort of for entertainment value, but it's a big part of my life. Our alternative technologies are. And, that's something for me that has always been an issue as someone with an anarcho-libertarian viewpoint.
Right.
Energy and agriculture are sort of the two big ones that, how did we get here? How are these policies established? And, we're using information technology that provides us with a lot of freedom, but it's powered by, it's plugged into a grid that's very much not part of a free market or a free society. And
sure. I'm glad I have you on for this, because I get a lot of emails about, either say crypto anarchy, where, how can I get this privacy? And everybody's just always asking these technological questions about how can I get free from the man, and one of the biggest things is energy, is electricity, is power.
Yeah.
How can I get free from that, or what's even going on with that? Most people don't even have a good understanding. Clearly, you've got the background to have that understanding. So, keep rolling. I think this is an interesting subject.
Yeah. Well, I think what a lot of people don't understand too is your IT, your internet, your cell phone, all the things that are providing you with the community that allows you to find out about the Free State Project, or to find out about an anarchist group in your area, or to find out about what Occupy is doing. If the power grid were all turned off, we'd all be standing alone in the dark, and our independence, our freedom would start to suffer the minute those lights went out. So how do you achieve that? There are people who have gone off the grid. A lot of people will do solar with batteries, and I've installed a lot of systems for people who wanted to go that route. But It's a really big and tough question, and for me, it's the single biggest issue. It provides a lot of fertile ground for thought experiments about how we get from here to a truly free society.
Right. Yeah, because I mean this is something I've mentioned this a couple times on Sovereign Tech before, where look, we have to deal with the fact that the internet was created by the government. Doesn't matter what any historian or any libertarian says, it was created by the government. The power system that we're dealing with right now was laid out and created by the government. And so what happens, how do we get away from, how do we get the government away from something that it's so ingrained in?
Mm-hmm.
If you take my meaning. And
Well,
go ahead.
absolutely, absolutely, and I've heard Douglas Rushkoff talk, and I've heard you talk about packet radio transmission, which I don't know much
Yeah.
about. I'd be fascinated to hear more about that. And it seems to me, in the last issue of Obsolete, we had an article about number stations and how people use shortwave radio to transmit encrypted information that's virtually untraceable.
Right.
And the radio waves cannot be turned off,
Right.
So there are obviously possibilities for completely independent systems out there, but getting from here to there is tough. And it's, as both of us being sci-fi heads, there in any kind of visions of the future where there's either a utopian or a dystopian vision, that's dependent on either the collapse of the energy system or the discovery of some sort of revolutionary energy supply. I mean,
Very true.
It's pretty key to the visions of the future, as I mean, if we were to be transported to a planet that had developed as a truly free society that had the same resources that we have here on Earth, I mean, how would you imagine people dealing with their energy needs? I mean, just as sort of a, off the top of your head idea. I mean, how do you think that would be? Would they generate it in their own homes? Would they be district systems? I mean, what do you think that would look like?
Yeah. Wow. Great question. The first thing, I don't know if this necessarily answers it. The first thing that came to my mind was, I remember reading about how if we actually colonized Mars, that we would actually want to have these polluting gigantic power plants because on Mars we would want there to be a greenhouse effect,
Right.
so it would warm the place up.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
So that's the first thing that popped in my head when you asked that question. Um, but yeah, I don't. I mean, I would, if I ended up on another planet, I guess if that's the, I mean, I'd probably want solar. Um, because it's just something that just seems so readily available, to access. Now, and actually, I mean, I'm curious to your answer to that question though.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree. I think solar electrical generation is the way to go, and I that's why I design and install solar electric systems
Right on.
for a living. But one of the things that has always sort of troubled me about the back to the land idea is that there's a big environmental component to that, and for each individual to have their own battery bank, and there's a lot of there are a lot of minerals, there's a lot of manufacturing that goes into building that system, and for each person to have their own individual power supply with the technology that we have right now is not very practical. So
Right.
I guess that brings me to a community power system, and then we start to get into, well, is this socialism or
Yeah.
Is this like anarcho-syndicalism? It starts to when it sort of starts to make some of our more hardcore libertarian friends cringe a little bit, um,
Sure.
uh, because you're all of a sudden dealing with the commons, and
Right.
and that's sort of where the energy thing has always sort of come apart. I mean,
Well, yeah,
so
if I real quick, if I can, yeah, I think that's interesting because something about, like, I know a lot of libertarians just want to come out and say it's like, well, if the government wasn't here, we'd already have the electric car. Well, I hope that the if the government wasn't here, that maybe the power system would be somehow superior, because if everybody had an electric car right now, the power grid couldn't handle it.
mhm.
And that's something to consider. But the philosophy behind that, I think, is very interesting, because the car is a very individual thing. And so if it's everybody having a car, but then it's a communal power system, the two don't seem to add up. Like, the communal power system can't handle the individuality, it would seem. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think that's exactly it because I spent some time as a lobbyist. I'll confess it. I'll come right out and say it. Uh, I got involved around the turn of the last century in an organization called the Iowa Renewable Energy Association, and at that time we were a lot of sort of Mother Earth News reader, Home Power Magazine reader, do-it-yourselfers,
Sure.
um, and plus some Y2Kers at that time. And we got together and built each other's power systems, and it was awesome. Um, I sort of started getting dragged into the policy realm because advocacy groups are always looking for professionals to trot out that they call real people to talk to
Right.
the politicians, right?
Sure.
And so I got more and more involved in this, and pretty soon I was working, doing consulting work for these advocacy groups, and then I was actually registered as a lobbyist for a couple of years, um, and I would go and argue with state and federal legislators about how why they should support renewable energy, and of course there were Republicans who said, well, if it's such a great idea, why can't it stand on its own? And the Democrats would say, well, if we need to tax the fossil fuel industries to pay for this, and we would get into these back and forth things, and then I would say, well, why don't we, you put a tax for everything else. You've got a utility usage tax. Why don't we take a penny of that tax and put it toward people who want to have renewable energy systems? To give them an incentive to do that, give them a tax break. And unfortunately, some of my environmental Democrat friends were the first to attack me and say that, well, this is a regressive tax. Poor people have to pay for the same electricity that rich people have to pay for. And so a tax
Mm.
on energy hits somebody who makes $30,000 a year or $15,000 or $6,000 a year much worse than it hits somebody who makes $250,000 a year.
Right. Right.
So we've got, not only do we have people using different amounts of power from the same grid, but we've also got people with different resources and needs that are right now drinking from the same well, so to speak.
Right.
So it all becomes very, very convoluted, and very difficult to get any group of your left-right paradigm Republican Democrat legislators on the same page to do anything. And when they do, it becomes incredibly watered down and nothing really gets done. So I don't know if that really answered your question, but yeah, so if you've got somebody who has an electric car, they're probably in an upper income bracket. They're
Right.
plugging into that power, and they're, if usage goes up, demand goes up, price goes up, and everybody pays. So, yeah, unless they're charging it from their own solar power system, really, they're increasing the demand for those coal plants and those new, natural gas peaking plants, and it's really, you know, I mean, it's only a small piece of the entire puzzle.
Right. So really, if everybody had an electric car, it wouldn't be very green, probably.
Right.
And make no mistake, I love the idea of high efficiency green technologies. I'm not like against them per se. And B, it would end up costing everybody a whole lot more, perhaps more than gas. Is that accurate to say?
I think that's probably accurate to say. Yeah. I mean, uh, an electric car is not necessarily the greenest option
Right.
between the power that it's using, where that comes from, plus the amount of industrial manufacturing that goes into one of them.
Sure, sure. Now, I mean, you brought up the politics of all this. I mean, is there anything kind of going on now as far as, with the political realm? What is happening in politics? With, or what may be even more interesting right now, depending on which way you want to go with this, is I'd be interested to really hear more of the history of how we got to where we are as far as energy production goes, as well as to what's going on now with, I mean, because politics does control, whether we like it or not, does control what's going on in energy production and energy in general.
Yeah. Well, over the years, I've given a presentation a lot of times where I try and provide some context to the whole thing. And I
Sure.
go through a sort of brief timeline, and I could kind of run through that with you now, or some of the highlights of that, if you want, and we can sort of talk as we go along about how we got to here from there.
Yeah, we could go over that. That'd be great.
Okay, well, as people will know, the first settlers, and even before the first settlers, the Native Americans, used exclusively what we now call renewable energy. They used sun to dry things, to heat things. They used wind, to sail,
Right.
to power things. They used what we now call biomass. They burned wood, or they burned grass, or um, things like peat, were stored
Yep.
basically on their way to being fossil fuels from being biomass. But it wasn't until really about the late 1850s that the first oil well in Pennsylvania sort of launched the contemporary fossil fuel industry. And before then, we really had an agriculturally based energy supply. People pretty much relied on forestry and hemp oil. Our old friend hemp was a big source of lighting fuel, and also whale oil was a big source of fuel. But um,
Sure, both of which now are pretty much illegal to get your hands on,
right,
in at least in the United States anyway.
exactly, and the whale thing, I can definitely see the need
Yep.
to protect species from extinction. I
Yeah.
mean, that's obvious. But the hemp oil thing, there's a lot of politics behind why we're not allowed to use hemp oil. So,
Sure.
uh, and a lot of that had to do with the mid 1800s. It all started with the ratification of the 14th Amendment that allowed corporate personhood to be established, and led to the launch of the first big corporations like Standard Oil. John D.
Right.
Rockefeller started Standard Oil, and that really, you know, started the era of the robber barons, if you want to call them that, or the great
Sure.
industrialists, if you want to call them that. But it really changed the whole landscape of how Americans lived and how energy was supplied. Um, in the 1880s, Edison built the first coal-fired electric generating station, powering some residents in New York City. And that's kind of what we'd call a district generation system. It powered one specific neighborhood.
So that this was like the first time that anybody had like they could flick a switch,
Right.
And something would happen.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so Edison, he was working right alongside the Vanderbilts and Westinghouse and all these other people. And of course, I know you're a fan of Nikola Tesla.
I am.
And Tesla worked for Edison for a while, and they went their separate ways over AC and DC. And
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and well, basically Tesla won out on that war. And if it weren't for Tesla's AC transmission, we probably wouldn't have the kind of grid we have today. And Edison was famous for going around with a sideshow and electrocuting dogs with alternating current to show how dangerous it was.
Okay.
The direct current that he used, I mean, if you go to older parts of New York, they're still wired for that Edison direct current. Tesla had energy transmission technology that was high frequency, that was actually carried through radio waves, and he was and so that was his sort of deal. And I've built a Tesla coil. I actually should put the plans for that in Obsolete sometime. You can build a Tesla coil out of an old galvanized tub and a case of long neck beer bottles and some tin foil and a copper toilet tank float and some wire. And, you can make the purple lightning shoot across the room. And, I used to be able to turn off the lights in my shop, and I'd turn on the Tesla coil, and it would light up all the fluorescent light fixtures in the entire shop. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And he had stuff that was way beyond. There are a lot of people, conspiracy fans, who would say that there are free energy technologies that Tesla developed and things which are not really true. I mean, there's free energy, obviously. But he had some pretty radical technologies that were never fully exploited. So I would definitely agree with that.
Okay.
But it was AC. It was the usage of AC that allowed for the long distance transmission of power from big generating stations out to the hinterlands like we have now, instead of everybody having a neighborhood generating station, which is the way Edison had imagined it.
Okay.
Okay, let's get back to the little timeline here. At the end of the 19th century, Rudolf Diesel was developing the diesel engine, and Henry Ford was developing the Model T, and both of these guys, originally invented these devices to run on either vegetable oil or ethanol, alcohol fuel. And this was a really big and revolutionary thing, and it really, really ticked off John D. Rockefeller. And, I don't think it's a coincidence. Rockefeller was famously a teetotaler and supported the women's suffrage movement. And a lot of his money went into passing prohibition laws. But what a lot of people don't understand is that under prohibition, as many or more on-farm ethanol stills were destroyed as actual whiskey stills. So these farmers who were making their own ethanol fuel to run in the old Model Ts and the 2N and 9N tractors that Ford was selling to farmers back in those days, they were unable to make their own fuel anymore under prohibition because the production of ethyl alcohol was prohibited.
See, now I hear that, and I'll just straight up admit it, that the thought that runs through my mind is that, okay, Prohibition was all about stopping ethanol fuel and not alcohol.
Well, again, just truth is stranger than fiction,
Sure.
and just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't out to get you.
Yeah,
As
right.
conspiracy theorist friends will say. Um,
Sure.
so yeah, I don't know what he was thinking, but I'm sure if it wasn't anything more than a pleasant side effect of his moral endeavors, that the fact that he completely and utterly smashed the ethanol industry um, probably didn't bother him a whole lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I could imagine that was all right. I mean, another interesting thing, and this is something I guess that sounds conspiratorial, but it's, in my opinion, absolutely true, and there's plenty of documentation to prove it. I remember seeing a few years ago when I lived in Florida, that there was like a little, I'll call it a museum essentially there, to a guy that in the 30s, I think it was, invented what he called it was called the fish carburetor, for cars, and this carburetor allowed for significantly, greater fuel efficiency. Um, and this carburetor was actually, they put it in the ads, in various, catalogs at the time so that you could order it. And in fact, a lot of companies, including ones run by Rockefeller, were saying, no, this is all a scam. This isn't true. When it was absolutely true, it really worked. And in fact, they started making them again in the 80s, I think, for a little while. And the U.S. Post Office even got behind it and would put that, would essentially not let the things ship,
Mm-hmm.
but they were quite real and they really worked. So these things do happen. Before any of my listeners think, "Whoa, this is some of this is going to be crazy town." Not at all. These companies would suppress this stuff.
No, that's absolutely true, and there are more cases. I'll point out a few more of them.
Sure.
In 1922, General Motors founded a special unit that went out and acquired streetcar lines, and they bought up virtually every electric streetcar line in the country, and they destroyed them all.
Okay, I've seen pictures of this
And
where there's literally electric cars piled on top of each
yeah,
other, right?
and they replaced them with buses, gasoline powered buses built by General Motors. And so again, here we're going, all right, well, is this the free market at work, or is this collusion between corporations and government to destroy, smaller companies that are providing something in the public commons that the public needs,
Right.
And that's in my days in the lobby, this was always where I knocked heads with Republicans. They simply weren't willing to admit that that they're probably the people who are their biggest campaign contributors, large businesses, a lot of them in the energy sector, had gotten to where they are through collusion with government. And so, yes, getting back to some of your libertarian friends who say if government hadn't been there, they might be right. That playing field might have been leveled and things might have been different. And a prime example of that is, a lot of people are seeing the wind industry growing now, and wind turbines are kind of a big new thing. Well, wind electrical generation from wind turbines started in the back at the turn of the century, and by 1931, a guy named Harv Stewart patented the first wind-powered battery charger, and started bringing electricity to farmers. So all across America, there were farmers who had wind turbines that were providing electricity for their crystal radio sets and their electric lights and a few appliances, and they were living, a life that their electric consumption was based on how much electricity they were able to produce, you know? So if they wanted to have new appliances, they had to have more batteries or they had to have more wind generation. Well, along about 1936, the Rural Electrification Act was passed, and that was to provide farmers with power from the electric grid. And this coincided with the Depression and the establishment of the Tennessee Valley Authority, in which the government bought up most of the electrical generating plants in Tennessee and later around the country. And they started building these rural electric lines. Well, they brought these rural electric lines out and they sold it very much on reducing the drudgery of farm life without electricity, you know. And so every farm life wanted it, every kid wanted it. Of course, they wanted to be able to listen to their radio shows, you know. Just
sure.
Imagine the radio was probably to them like the cell phone or whatever is now.
Right.
But the requirement to getting hooked up to these new rural electric cooperatives, which were cooperatives sponsored by the government, was that you had to disassemble your wind generator. You were not allowed to get government power if you had your own wind generator. And the reason for this was because they said if they were hooked up to the same lines and there was a power outage, that these generators, if they were running, would backfeed onto the grid and could electrocute a lineman. Well, up until in the early 2000s, when I was negotiating with the lobbyists from the rural electric cooperatives, they were still saying that wind power couldn't be hooked to their systems because it was dangerous for their linemen. Now, there's never actually been a reported case of a lineman being electrocuted by a wind turbine, not since the 30s.
Right.
And the new electrical generating equipment, the inverters that hook the new wind turbines to the grid have what's called anti-islanding, which means if the grid goes down, the turbine stops producing. So there's a virtually 0% chance of getting electrocuted. But nonetheless, the rural electric cooperatives, which are part of the United States Department of Agriculture, were lobbying against farmers being able to put up wind turbines and produce their own power. And that goes on to now. The wind industry was suppressed until wind power got profitable enough that large producers, utility companies themselves, could start turning a profit by putting up large-scale wind turbines, which is what they're doing now.
Right. Now, that was going to be my next question, because I know to some degree that in some setups, if you have at your home, if you have a wind turbine set up, that you can actually sell back electricity to the electric company.
It's in pretty rare cases. Usually what they'll do is they'll offer you a net metering agreement. This goes for solar too, which means that you will be credited. So when the wind's blowing or the sun is shining, you're making more power than you use, you will get retail credit for your excess.
Gotcha.
And usually what they'll want to do after that, if you're producing more than you're using, either on a monthly or annual basis, depending on how they want to true that up, they will offer you what they call avoided cost, which is their cost of production.
Okay.
So, and they won't tell you how they come up with their number for their cost of production, because it's a black box, proprietary. It's part of their contract with whatever state they're in. So they don't have to tell you how they come up with the number. But for instance, if you're paying 14 cents a kilowatt hour and you're getting retail rate for that, and you make more than you're using, then they will be happy to pay you 3 cents a kilowatt hour to buy back your excess power.
Okay. Okay. Now that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, but Yeah, this is interesting because you're saying about how, people were told that, hey, if you have this wind turbine hooked up to to the main electric system, that it's going to feedback, it's going to kill a lineman. And but like you said now, I've seen them all over the place, these gigantic, football field sized wind turbines, generating systems that the state's putting up
Mm-hmm.
in areas. But so now they're not going to kill linemen. How does that work?
Yeah. Well, see, now these are considered generating facilities. These aren't just, some little thing. These are actual power plants, and
Okay.
they're governed by the same set of rules that any other power plant is. Well, again, like here in the state of Iowa, we're the number two wind power producer in the country, right behind Texas,
Okay.
and the whole northwest quadrant of the state is you can barely get out of sight of the big 300-foot monster turbines, and
Sure.
the majority of those are owned by um, Berkshire Hathaway, which is owned solely by Warren Buffett. So he owns nearly every wind turbine in the state. Now, Mid American Energy, which is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, was the biggest opponent of wind power development in the state of Iowa, right up until the time they passed a law that allowed them to own their own wind power generation instead of buying it from farmers.
Okay.
So as soon as they passed that law, with the help of our ex-governor Tom Vilsack, then they started building their own wind power production, and now they're the biggest wind producer in the state. Well, oddly enough, our friend Tom Vilsack, who, after not running for re-election for governor of the state of Iowa, worked for a time as a consultant for Mid American Energy before being tapped by Barack Obama to be the new head of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So it's the same players. They just keep shuffling the players around the board and
Right.
with the same results.
So yeah, so I mean, this can't help but sound like, because no, well, we can do the wind power thing as long as it's going to make the big boys money, and as long as it's going to be controlled. But you can't do it if it's something personal, and it does sound like, like you said, was it 1936 when this started?
Mm-hmm.
That they were just trying to get people dependent,
Yeah, exactly.
and to get, yeah, and boy, that can't help but smack of of real life conspiracy, of like the real thing.
Right. Well, there are people who will say that rural America has always been the root of all sorts of radical ideas that have been in direct conflict with the sort of in the vision of the industrial North, and their people say
Okay.
this was this was the true root of the Civil War, despite the fight to free slaves and all that sort of thing, was to suppress the agrarian South. And I don't know if I believe that or not, but it most
Yeah, I'm up to debate on that too.
yeah,
Yeah,
but
I hear you.
it most certainly is a fact that after the Civil War, that the USDA was formed under the Lincoln administration, and that they that the goal, how did it go? I'd have to look it up, but it was something like the USDA's mission is to free up rural resources to service the new industrial economy. So it really had nothing from the beginning to do with helping farmers in any way.
Right, with farming. Yeah. Okay.
It's really about industrializing agriculture. And by industrializing agriculture and bringing the young guys off the farm and into the factory floor, they're able to depopulate those rural areas, and they're able to, you could argue that their people are easy to control. They're living in the suburbs, they're watching TV, they're working at a factory, and they're not out there, in the woods, hunting for their own food and coming up with all sorts of radical anti-government ideas.
Right.
And I think there's a dimension of that. I mean, I think it's kind of undeniable.
Yeah, I agree. I'm as listeners of the show know, I'm big into paleo diet and paleo lifestyle, as they call it. And a lot of people talk about this, interestingly, and it's often not coming from libertarian circles, though you can certainly hear it there too, that before there was even like farming, interestingly enough, that there, you couldn't, like nomads that were hunter-gatherer societies, you couldn't govern them because they weren't in like one place. But then interestingly, it can kind of evolve to the next thing, to where, if you get farmers away from the farm and into the cities, then you can govern them even better,
Right.
than when they're on the farms.
Yeah.
So it just keeps getting, the system of control, one could say, culturally, just keeps getting stronger and stronger.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, another interesting case of the players being shuffled around and how deep the history of these energy sort of I don't know, family legacies, is in 1942, when the U.S. government seized the assets of Union Banking Corporation for financing IG Farben, part of the Nazi war machine.
Okay.
The president of UBC at that time was Prescott Bush, who was the grandfather
Right.
of George Bush. And of all the funds that were seized during the beginning of the Nazi era, this is before we declared war, the only assets that were given back were those invested by Prescott Bush in IG Farben. And he took that $1.5 million that he had invested in IG Farben, and he bought a Texas oil company with that. And, and fast forward to, the involvement of Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. with Ken Lay of the Enron Corporation, and what happened with deregulation in California. And then Dick Cheney's energy task force that was tasked with reestablishing America's energy dominance. These things, it's like we've got the same players from the mid 20th century on, all setting the stage for consolidating these energy resources. And they've been doing it, and it continues to this day.
Right. So there hasn't been any real growth. There hasn't been any real new players. If there were any new players, they've more or less been crushed, it would seem. Wow. I mean, it's hard to think of. I mean, when you think about the fact that, say, like, your average, I'll say, electronics company, for 5 years, Sony's the big thing. Then for another 5 years, Samsung's the big thing. But in these industries, in the energy industry, it seems like, no, it doesn't change at all. These guys just keep running the show forever. And there isn't any growth.
Mm-hmm. And that's because of the system of government we've got right now, which takes us back to, how do we get there from here? And I think there's a lot to be said for non-participation, but your energy dollars are going directly into this big slush fund, and so I think people need to think really seriously about how they're powering their technology. How this is all going down. When I was a kid, we thought, before 3 Mile Island and all that stuff, we thought nuclear power was going to be the thing. If we were reading sci-fi in the late 60s, early 70s, and we were just all about the nuclear power thing. This is going to be great. And
oh yeah, even Ford made a car they designed a car called the Ford Nucleon that was going to be a nuclear powered car in the 60s.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it was going to be too cheap to meter, they said,
Yeah.
that was the big catchphrase. Well, what happened? The government again got involved, cost overruns. No one was ever able to build a really safe and efficient plant, and here we are. I mean, we've never been able to get that to where it needed to be to provide to fulfill its potential. And is that
Right.
because of government involvement, or was the technology just not there? I mean, um, would those containment vessels have cracks in them if they were built without government regulation? I mean, uh, it's hard to say, but
Yeah, that's a tough area to talk about because I mean it gets into such hypotheticals, and I think if you want to, especially if you want to like talk to say the average person about this, they want real world results, and they want to like know, and
well,
and so go ahead.
no, no, that's exactly right. And I ran into this when I used to do some work for the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is a think tank in DC. And there were when climate change took center stage in the energy debate, which is part of the reason I got out of it, just because I never felt like I was an expert on climate change. I was just a guy who liked solar power, and
I don't think anybody's an expert on it
yeah, yeah,
because
but there were people there who were experts on it, and
uh,
some pretty highly regarded scientists within the organization wanted to release a white paper on nuclear power and its potential advantages for mitigating climate change. And there was a huge war within this organization between more environmentally minded individuals who didn't even want to bring up the subject of nuclear energy, and those more engineering science based folks who said, well, if we're going to make a change, everything needs to be on the table. So again, we're having folks with economic interests and technological interests and environmental interests who just can't get on the same page about this stuff.
right. Yeah, I mean, I've heard, I mean, some recent things I know I've heard about, especially like with the nuclear thing, is there's people who are saying, well, they stopped development of thorium, which thorium might have been an alternative that wouldn't have been as bad as what's used now. There's other things, and it's interesting, especially with the nuclear energy idea, is that it really is so new, and that development. In fact, I remember I think it was a TED talk with Bill Gates where I mean, and everybody can take what Bill Gates says with a grain of salt, but he laid out. He said there hasn't been new development in the field of nuclear energy in 25 years, and it's only been around for maybe 50.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's people who are just instantly saying no, 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 no nuclear energy when it's not even something that arguably hasn't been thoroughly researched, at all to look at. So go ahead.
Oh, I was going to agree with you. I mean, there are small, university scale nuclear power plants around the country, that are
Right.
basically sitting there making power. I mean, they're nuclear powered submarines. The last few years, Warren Buffett's Mid American Energy has been wanting to build a new nuclear power station in Iowa, and they've been beat back by the environmental interests several times. And I just kind of said, well, what are we going to do? Do you want to keep buying a new iPhone every year? Do you want to keep using more electricity? If you do, then we need to talk seriously about how we're going to make that. And
Yeah,
these
it's
small
a real
plants, there's some talk about doing these small district nuke plants, and people freak out because they don't want them in their backyard. Well, or they don't want a new coal power plant in their backyard. But this is the reality of energy production as we know it now. I mean, if people want renewable energy, which I want, and I'd like to install it at your house for you,
right on.
it's going to cost you more money. You can't have both.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's the interesting thing that always gets me is that again with the with a lot of the environmentalists, and I support a lot of what they have to say, but they they want everybody using electric cars, but then they don't want to do anything that allows for more energy production, so like really serious more energy production, and it's like yeah, which way do you want it?
Right.
What how do you want this to go?
Well, a lot of
Uh,
people scoffed at George Bush when he said, what do you want to do to defeat the terrorists? Go shopping, right? And
yeah.
and but then by the same token, the same people who pilloried him for such an inane statement are the first to turn around and go, well, we can save the environment by buying green dishwashing detergent. It's like
Right.
by buying a new green car. I I drive an old 1986 K5 Army surplus Blazer with a diesel engine in it that I run on biodiesel made from recycled deep fat fryer oil. Okay, and
Incredible.
I pull into that thing. It's full camouflage paint job, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I'll pull into the local food co-op and park between two Priuses, and I will get the stink eye from the Birkenstock wearing Prius drivers,
Oh, right. Just because it's an SUV
right?
when they have no idea.
That
Yeah.
I'm zero emissions, and that that the carbon footprint of this vehicle washed away in the sands of time, long before their Prius was ever built. And
Yeah.
and it's like you cannot buy a new Prius every 4 years and say you're an environmentalist. It's the way,
No, no, you're right.
was it oh, there's a comedian, I can't think of his name right now, but he says he saw a Prius with a baby seat in the back, and he wanted to smash the window, take the baby seat, and leave a condom and say, if you're a real
Yeah.
environmentalist,
Yeah.
use this.
Oh, that's good. I told, yes.
Stanhope. It's just Doug Stanhope
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. That is that. Yeah, absolutely. That's funny.
Uh,
Yeah. So, all right. I mean, so then on the modern end of things, I mean, what is going on? Like you said, nuclear option, or I mean, nuclear power seems to be something that's just deadlocked. It's not going to happen.
non-starter. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what's going on now? I mean, what are they talking about? Because we see all these initiatives, for like I think President Obama said, we got to increase the energy output by 2020 or something. I mean, what are people doing?
Well, there are a couple interesting developments. Solar has come down. The price of installed solar PV, electric generating solar, has come down 50% in the last 3 years. We were installing systems for $12 a watt a couple of years ago. Now we're installing closer to $4.
Wow.
So, and that's pre-tax credit, pre-rebate, all that kind of stuff. And so those numbers, that doesn't have a whole lot to do with our government having incentivized solar, despite what naysayers and fossil fuel advocates would say. That's market demand. That's straight up market
Right.
demand there. Of course, you got to acknowledge that it's a global energy economy too, and a lot of that demand is not in the United States.
Yeah.
A lot of those panels are going to your socialist, quote, socialist countries of Northern Europe, but they're proving that solar works, and America is starting to catch on. And right now, we're installing systems that are grid tied. They're feeding the energy back into the grid. But there are companies that are starting to innovate and do some district systems. SMA, which is a German company, but they have a wing called SMA America, is producing a thing they call the Sunny. Their inverters are called Sunny Boy, and they have the Sunny Boy Island, which allows for a whole group of homes to run off the same solar array and the same battery bank. So, like there's an eco village here in Iowa, in Fairfield, that is a completely off-grid community, and they share a wind turbine and they share a battery bank. And, so people are looking at building and doing new developments where they have community power systems.
Right.
And the bottom line is that until people have to pay the real cost of their energy, whether that's cleaning up the smog from the coal plant, or burying the nuclear waste, or new batteries for the community solar system or whatever, people are just going to continue to use more and more power without really thinking about where it comes from.
Right.
So, my feeling is that, one of the things Obama wants to do is huge upgrades to the long distance transmission lines. And I'm saying, why are we not doing district systems?
Okay.
And we're starting to see that. Universities, colleges are starting to do that, and things like hospitals. There used to be neighborhoods, and I don't know about where you went to school, but where I went to college, they had a central heating plant for the whole campus, and it was piped all around. They had one giant boiler that heated it, and now they're looking at doing things like that for communities. And when you're doing combined heat and power, where you're able to capture the heat from the generation of the power, you're able to up your efficiency massively. So, you build a power plant, even if it's a natural gas plant that's burning fossil fuels, you capture the heat, turn the heat into something usable. You heat the local, aquatic center, or you heat the city hall, or you heat the downtown area with the heat that's a byproduct of the electric generation, and all of a sudden you've got something that's worth talking about. And it's going to be these efficiencies, these community systems that are going to be, as far as I'm concerned, are going to be the key to our survival in the future energy economy. Unfortunately, it's not going to be your off-grid folks with a battery bank living in a Mother Earth News log cabin in the woods. We just can't all do that, and a lot of people don't want to do that. So we need to look at community-based solutions, I think, is really where it's at.
Yeah, now that's interesting. And I've heard, I have some friends who are big into, more of the Mother Earth News types. And I mean, they're full on, for the phraseology, they're full on anarcho-capitalists, but even they will admit, because they've messed with this stuff with these, like battery banks, at their house and all that community solutions are the only feasible way for them to have any like real energy production. And I mean, not just energy production, but also, just like food, and then things like that. So all the way around, there seems to be kind of that need for community. And that's interesting, because it would seem to stand in stark contrast to anarchist ideas, to where it's all about the individual. Yet at the same time, it seems like, but this lifestyle that we have does seem to rely on some kind of community-based, production. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, do you know who Carl Hess was?
Yes.
Carl Hess, for listeners who don't know who he was started off as Barry Goldwater's speechwriter. He was a arch conservative back in the 60s. And when he stopped working for Goldwater, he sort of went underground and became really sort of one of the proto anarcho-libertarians of the late 60s, early 70s. And Carl Hess wrote a book called Community Technology. And he went from being a Capitol Hill speechwriter to doing these underground community sustainability projects in the ghetto in Washington, D.C., where they were growing tilapia in tanks in the basement of abandoned buildings, and they were doing home-built solar heating systems. And I don't know if I just mentioned the book Community Technology, which was sort of the outgrowth of that. It's a very short little book. I think it's out of print, but you can still probably find copies. You could probably find a PDF of it online if people wanted to look. It's Carl Hess, Carl with a K.
Right.
And he was all about that. I mean, he was as anarchist he could be, but he recognized that, nobody lives in a vacuum, and that it's important for a group of people to get together and get their, achieve freedom together. As a person living in New Hampshire, you can totally grok that, I know.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, that's the way to go. And unfortunately, of course, the IRS came after Carl Hess, and he fled into the woods of Kentucky or someplace and lived out the rest of his life as a commercial welder, I think. But a great guy. There are YouTube videos of his speeches and things, and I would encourage people to check out Carl Hess, because he was really a pretty good model for how you can go from being a libertarian conservative to sort of embracing a community model of anarchism, and that agricultural thing and the energy thing are the two keys. And those were the utopian societies of the hippie 60s. That's generally where they fell apart, when the crops failed or when they didn't have enough firewood to get through the winter. Everybody headed back to the city and shaved off their beards and became yuppies,
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I mean, whether it's in your neighborhood, and this is the thing, Home Power magazine has gotten to be sort of the voice of small scale residential renewable energy, and it always has been. But they used to be a little more radical, and they used to have a column called Guerrilla Solar, which basically featured systems that people installed without the permission of their utility company, that backfed their meters and would run their meters backwards. And I always loved that idea. I loved the Guerrilla Solar idea. And now I don't encourage people to do Guerrilla Solar, because the new digital meters won't record your outgoing power. So you'll be feeding the grid free power, and you don't want to do that.
Oh no,
no. Don't do a Guerrilla Solar system tied to your local utility company. It'll be nothing but grief. But I do encourage people there's no reason why you can't yourself or get together with a neighbor and set up a solar array that is not connected to your utility company at all. And you don't have to ask anyone's permission. And you can take a few circuits out of your circuit panel, like say you want your office to be completely solar powered. Well, rewire it so that goes to a battery bank, and you've got one room that's completely free from the man. You can start that way. You can, if you've got a camper, or I have for years on my truck used solar panels on the roof to charge all my cordless tools, so they were always ready to go when I went to a job. And, there are tons of ways that you can integrate renewable energy into your life without asking anyone's permission, and by working together with your neighbors. So there are a lot of options out there. And going back to Obsolete magazine, go dig out some of those old copies of Mother Earth News and the whole Earth catalog from the 70s, and those ideas are just as good now as they were back then.
Yeah, I would agree. I also, just real quick, I'll point out that actually I know Mother Earth News anyway offers I think they're like $50, and you can get 30, 40 years, however long, of issues on CD, and you can just pop it into your computer, and you can do searches even, which makes it even better.
Yep. Same with Home Power. If you get a $1 subscription for the digital edition, you can tap all their back issues all the way back to the beginning.
Right. So you would definitely say that solar power, that's kind of the way things are heading. That's the way that do you see that as freedom from the grid that the government has laid out?
I think it's the one that's in front of us right now. That's the most cost efficient cost effective, and the technology is completely ready for prime time. I mean, there's great equipment out there. You're not going to have to buy some crappy Chinese junk to do a good system. You can make a rock solid system. You can do a lot of stuff. You could build your own solar panels, by buying individual broken cells or something. I mean, there are all sorts of wacky things online that you can do, but you can, for a decent price, you can buy a small array that'll give you some real energy, some real independence from the electrical grid for sure.
Incredible. So, okay, go ahead if you had more.
Nope.
Okay. Yeah, so this is stuff, I imagine, like you mentioned, Obsolete Magazine again. I mean, this is stuff you could find on Obsolete Magazine.
Sure. Yeah, the methane digester, heck, you can build that with a couple of 55-gallon drums and start throwing your dog poop and your grass clippings in there, and in about 4 days you can fire your Weber grill with it. Can't go wrong with that, right?
No, right. I love it. Rich, did you have anything else you wanted to mention? This energy topic is absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure it's something actually we could probably even talk about more in the future. Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to discuss as far as what's going on? That's
no, I mean, I just would encourage people to do research. Right after scoffing at the Chinese solar technology, I will say you can buy an off-the-shelf methane digester that would replace a septic tank. They do that in China. They actually use their waste to produce burnable gas. In India, they use rooftop digesters for food scraps that it's turned into cooking gas. I mean, there's tons of stuff out there, and you don't have to buy a $10,000 solar array to do something. I mean, if you want a DIY solution, they're out there. There are just tons of them online. You just search for DIY solar on Start Page or one of your other non-NSA monitored web search engines, and you'll find endless resources.
Incredible. Yeah, I definitely encourage my listeners to do the same. I think it's an exciting time because the information is right now anyway. The information is out there available, and pretty much for free a lot of times, to look into this stuff. And if it's not for free, there's also plenty of other things available to look into that. Partly so, Obsolete Magazine again. Rich, if you want to just talk about your Kickstarter a little more again, give us a recap on Obsolete Magazine, because fantastic publication.
Yeah, thanks. Again, we've got a Kickstarter campaign going through August 11th. You can find out about it by going to Kickstarter.com and searching for Obsolete Magazine, or go to obsolete-press.com. Again, you can read back issues. You can check out Obsolete and see what it's all about, and decide if you want to pledge to the campaign. And if people don't know, they probably do by now, but the cool thing about Kickstarter is if we don't reach our goal, you don't get charged. So it's not like I'm taking money for something that we can't deliver down the road because we didn't raise enough. It's an all or nothing deal, so there's no risk in pledging. I'd encourage people to look at Obsolete, contribute, write, make artwork, do all those things that, keep us free. And if you have questions about renewable energy projects, I'm always up for providing folks with a little feedback on ideas. They can contact me at actually through the contact page on obsolete-press.com is probably the easiest thing to do.
Sure.
That goes directly to my personal email account. I would just love to hear from folks, and hope they've gotten some good information from our talk today. It's been a lot of fun.
Just a tremendous topic, again, that spans clearly such a long period of time. And at some points sounds, it sounds woo-woo, but it's not. it is what it is. And the proof is out there, and I'll put a lot of links in the show notes to some of the things that you've been mentioning during this, Rich, that I think people will find interesting if they want to look into it more. So again, Rich Dana, thank you so much for being on.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, and this has been Sovryn Tech, and of course I am Brian Sovryn, and we will talk to you later.
This has been Sovryn Tech. Visit us at sovryntech.com. That's SOVRYN tech.com. There you can connect with us, see more of what you've heard on today's show, and catch our podcast feed. Sovryn Tech is open source. We encourage you to share. Later, nerds.